thank you for coming, and I'll start by saying I probably will break a couple of the rules, partly based on my own research, which shows, in fact, talking about carbon pricing separate from climate change doesn't lead to any support for carbon pricing. So we're going to talk about a little bit about climate change, and we are going to talk a little bit about the federal system, but my role is really to set this up. I do a lot of work on federal provincial policy. I do a lot of work on carbon pricing. So if there's things to talk about, we can certainly do that in the questions, but my job is to set things up. So we're going to basically talk a little bit about some of the most recent research that's come out on climate change. It's been in the news a lot lately, and I just want to summarize that very quickly. Talk just a bit about climate change in New Brunswick to give us a context of why this is important to us. Show you where our emissions come from and what the link is between those emissions and climate change. A quick overview of carbon pricing, and then share with you what I've learned about how we should and should not talk about it. So if you've been watching it all lately, you might have seen the World Meteorological Association just put out their annual report, and it is definitely getting hot in here. We are now at a concentration level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere far beyond safe levels, and continuing on a pathway toward even unsafer levels. To see that 409 parts per million, this is just carbon dioxide measurement in the atmosphere, is terrifying. Given where David and I started in 1990, 1992 on these issues, we've seen at least a 40–50% increase in emissions over that time. So it's very, very concerning to watch those numbers go up year after year after year. Oh. You may have also heard of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They did a special report on what the implications are for the world if warming continues beyond where we are today. On average, the world has increased 1 degree. That's a very, very soft number when you think about it on as an average. You think, what could that mean? It's not that big a deal. Canada has warmed double that level since the pre-industrial time. But their job was to look at what would happen to the world if we allowed warming to go beyond this 1 degree toward 1.5 degrees. We've been talking for a long time about what would happen at 2 degrees. But 1.5 degrees was something that small island states really wanted to have discussed because they're so susceptible to sea level rise. And what they found was, in fact, the consequences of just 1.5 degrees are so serious that we can't even think about 2 degrees. But I wanted to show this sign to you, this 12 years to do something sign. And the reason for that is that I would tell you when I get into the communication side of this, don't say that. The idea of talking about 12 years before we run out of time means go to sleep and wake up in 12 years. We're so far beyond that. We are talking urgent action today and of a monumental scale, something we've never had to deal with before. On top of that, the Lancet, a very respectable and respected medical journal, has been doing a countdown on climate change and health. Very powerful work that they've been doing. Their work just released their latest report this week, and it included a Canada chapter. And this is maybe not as clear as it could be to you, but some key messages that I just want to share with you. If you look at the first element, they're essentially arguing that we could essentially wipe out the Sustainable Development Goals achievement in terms of health and wealth and prosperity, wealth not necessarily in material terms, and that we have the opportunity here to really bring suffering to the world if we're not going to make the changes that we need to make. The big thing that happened in this report that this to me is fundamentally important and important to the experience that we've been having of climate change in New Brunswick, and that is the discussion about the mental health effects of climate change. The mental health effects of wildfires, the mental health effects of being displaced from your home because of flooding, losing the things that matter to you. The consequences of this are very serious and they're becoming an urgent issue, and you're seeing increasingly messaging that climate change is a public health issue. Oh. So just to give you a sense of a concept and why what we do in New Brunswick matters. And it is this idea that there is a global carbon budget, that there's only so much that can go into the atmosphere before we tip into temperature increases that would be completely unsafe. And I think we're already in that zone, but I want to give you the idea of what a global carbon budget means. And what the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel, talked about around this 1.5 degrees is that if you want a chance, a 50% or a 60% probability of staying below those temperature goals, then you need to slow and reduce and drastically decline the rate of emissions so that we get to a point where we're essentially not emitting greenhouse gases in the world. We're on a net kind of zero basis. And if you look at those three bars, you've got 3 degrees, 2 degrees, and 1.5 degrees. Those little lines in the bottom of 1.5 are the probabilities, 33%, 50%, and 66%. And yes, the IPCC talked about 12 years, but it's based on only a 50% probability. If you want a higher probability of success, you have less time. And so the consequences are serious. We're talking that, 4, 5, 10 years, we are in a situation where there's so much decline in the global carbon budget that it means that every single one of us has a contribution to make. Every single day that we do something that contributes to more emissions going into the atmosphere, we are taking our unfair share of the global carbon budget. And so that's the kind of way I think we need to think about climate change in terms of the global carbon budget and what is our fair share and how do we share that with others around the world. Keep going wrong here. Okay, Katherine Hayhoe, if you want to follow up on a scientist who is the world's best scientist right now in communicating climate change, she is the front person who is speaking about the latest report that came out last week, the U.S. climate assessment. And she's very clear in how she communicates, and I love it. It's real, it's us, it's bad, it's here, it's getting worse, but we have choices, and they do make a difference, so we need to act now. Just going to show you very quickly, in case you don't know, that there is some very good work being done to help us understand in New Brunswick what it means to us. And this is just a set of projections showing what we think. And here's just a chart on hot days, what we can expect for hot days. And over the current kind of period, we could speak 30 plus degrees days. Maybe there's 3 or 4 of those in summer. We're increasing to about 10 and potentially going up to that happening 24 or 25 times a summer. Precipitation is getting more intense, and so we're seeing this combination of more intense rainfall, greater flood risk, and they're showing you here how many times a year we could see rainfall events of more than 20 millimeters and so on. So you can see there's an increase there. And this is looking at growing degree days. Obviously our growing season getting somewhat longer, summer drought being an issue that can happen there. So just to show you that we do have some sense of how climate change will affect us here in the province. And so as a result of these events, we are seeing quite a change in the situation we face in New Brunswick. 6 weather disasters, 100 million in costs just in New Brunswick. And we've had, of course, MV power costs, which affect our rates. Spring flood alone at $80 million. So these costs are piling up. So what is our contribution, which gets me into the segue into the conversation about carbon pricing? In New Brunswick, and if you were to look at this kind of chart across the country, it would be very, very different. In New Brunswick, our biggest source of emissions is electricity. Why would that be? What makes greenhouse gas emissions come from our electricity in New Brunswick?
Coal.
Coal where?
Belgium.
Belgium, and what else? Coulson Cove, heavy oil. We also have a huge gas plant in Bayside, so there's quite a bit of greenhouse gas emissions, and that is our largest contribution. If you were in Manitoba or Quebec or Newfoundland, Labrador, it would be almost zero because they have a hydro-based system. So electricity tells the story of what kind of energy system you have pretty much anywhere in the country. After that, it's transportation. That's all of us. Driving and doing what we do, and delivery of goods and services, and then industry, followed by buildings, agriculture, and waste. But I wanted to show you here, because we're going to get into this talk about carbon pricing and what's fair, where our biggest emitters are in the province. So the largest emitter in the province, you shouldn't be surprised, is the refinery in St. John, 3 million tons a year, followed by Beldoon, Bayside Power, Coulson Cove, and then you get into Glencore in Beldoon and so on, the pulp and paper mills and so on. So carbon pricing. So how come we have so many students here tonight? Why are you here tonight? Are you just burning and dying to know more about carbon pricing? What got you here tonight? So go ahead. You can tell the rest of us. How come you're here?
You made us come. Bonus marks.
Bonus marks. That's pricing. That's how pricing works. Pricing changes behavior. A price was put on the value of your mark, you responded, and you showed up. That's carbon pricing. We're going to talk about how that works. But economists love it more than anybody else. They really, really love it. Here, I'm just going to read to you a great quote from Ecofiscal Commission. The answer is carbon pricing. Period. The answer is carbon pricing. The only truly market-based approach to reducing emissions. The whole logic of carbon pricing is to recognize that greenhouse gas emissions impose genuine costs that aren't reflected in market prices. When costs and prices are unaligned, Adam Smith's famous invisible hand is misled. By explicitly putting a price on carbon emissions, market prices for all goods and services will reflect the true underlying costs, and the result will be an important economic adjustment. Faced with higher prices for carbon-intensive products or processes, families and businesses will modify their production and consumption behavior in ways that reduce total emissions. What could go wrong? 100,000 people on the streets of France. 3 people have died. And this is a protest primarily driven by the response to carbon pricing. The price of carbon on fuels in France is approaching the social cost of carbon. So there's a big gap between what we know from the economic side of things and what people feel in their day-to-day lives. Now, I'm not saying there aren't other issues in France, but if you read any of this write-up, what's happened is they've added a significant jump on diesel and gasoline carbon pricing on their fuels, and it's approaching $1.72, $1.80 something a liter. That's about what you need to actually change behavior. But we are in a culture that has real issues around A, whether that's the right thing to do, whether it's fair, and there are distributional issues. And so there is a question of how you do it, and I know Tony's going to talk about that. All right, so I do lots and lots of survey work on carbon pricing. I've been studying carbon pricing for 4 years. I've been studying how to talk about it and what people think about it, what their values are, what their beliefs are, what drives them to support or oppose it. And so what I can tell you about carbon pricing is that people are willing to take it, maybe. It's very soft support, but there is support. Our most recent survey shows about 60% of Canadians do support carbon pricing, but most of that is in the somewhat support. You have a far smaller number of folks who are in the strongly support. But it is about 2 to 1 if you say how many people oppose, how many people support. So there's something there. People are willing to take this on. But not if you're a conservative and not if you live in Alberta, right? There is your worldview has a huge influence on how you interpret these solutions, even though generally speaking, a more conservative ideology is said to believe in market-based mechanisms. But they're in a box on this problem of carbon pricing. It's a mechanism that they should like, but we've got this difficult political and worldview situation influencing how people interpret it. And we do have variation across the country. So they'll just show you down to the Atlantic. 27% are strongly supportive rather than strongly opposed, 21%. So we have a bit more strongly support than oppose. But that can change. It can change very quickly if people have certain concerns that are brought to the fore, and I'll talk about that quickly. Interestingly, liberal-leaning people, and I don't mean this necessarily as a political thinking, but liberal-leaning people tend to be more supportive. Only 7% of Conservatives, 32% of NDP, 41% of the Bloc, 29% of the Greens, and that might surprise you. The majority of the Green support is in the softer category, 42%. Now these are national numbers, but everybody comes at this from a different perspective. It's important to understand that. And if you actually talk about money, support really drops off. And it's very important to understand that. Why did I spend so much time getting your heart in the right place to have this conversation by talking to you about climate change? It's because that activates your collective values. It activates what you care about in your communities and your families and the people around you. When people talk about money, we activate our selfish values. And so as soon as you bring in, this is 10 cents per liter, 11 cents per liter in 2022, it's all over. So here's how the federal government quickly tried to respond to that. So Tony will go into this in great detail, but I'm just going to give you a setup here. Because they have a real issue with this messaging that's counter to carbon pricing and what economists' consensus is. And the messaging is that carbon pricing is a tax grab, that it is unfair, that it will raise the cost of living, and that it doesn't even work. I have tested that message. It is a perfectly wonderful message for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and it works. It absolutely, I can show you statistically, reduces support for carbon pricing. So what did the federal government just do? They tried to respond to the attack that it was going to do two things, that it was a tax grab and that it would raise the cost of living. And they did that by saying any money that we raise in your province will be returned to households. Households will get more money back than they likely will pay for carbon pricing, and we can talk about some of the details for that. That's a direct response to the legitimate concerns of regular people about what does this mean to me. So what about industry? Are they paying their fair share? If you're a consumer, you're paying 20 bucks a ton starting January 1st, going 30, 40, and then 50 on 100% of your emissions. But if you're industry, and especially if you're an emissions-intensive, trade-exposed industry, you will actually only pay a carbon price on potentially 10% of your emissions if you are very trade-exposed, like iron and steel, or just 20, up to 20, it could be zero, depending on how you are. And I'm sure Tony will describe this a little bit. But essentially what they're going to do is say, you know, what does your plant emit relative to the industry average? Are you better than that, or are you worse than that? If you're better than that, you're going to get credits. If you're worse than that, you're going to pay. So that's essentially how that's going to work. And so we don't really know how it'll work in New Brunswick yet, but the New Brunswick government has said essentially that the federal government system will apply here. And so the credits can be sold or banked and used for future requirements. And they can buy credits if they have to from other industries. Okay, so the question about whether or not regulation or carbon pricing, and I think this is an important thing. We are here to talk about carbon pricing, but actually we're here to talk about climate action. Carbon pricing is one part of a comprehensive approach to climate change. And that's partly because we all don't think like economists, right? We just don't. And unfortunately, most people would prefer something they don't see so much. They would prefer regulation, A, because they think it works better, but also because they think it won't cost them. So even though it's a least efficient or like more costly approach, measurement after measurement after measurement shows people prefer regulation. And so they really want to see, you know, despite the fact that, you know, you think the most effective, the least cost system would be the thing that everybody would want. What you're seeing is, and it just happened in Ontario, that they basically announced a system that will cost, it could be 100 times more. It's crazy, $500 a ton instead of what it was going to cost at 20 bucks a ton. It's crazy. And so this is a direct result of public concern that we're getting these inefficient outcomes. Okay. The reality is, though, people are never going to love carbon pricing. And so I want to talk to you very quickly before I close out what it is that people will put up with if certain conditions are in place. People will support carbon pricing if they think it's fair. And mostly that's a fairness definition based on distribution, right? Is it fair? Are big polluters, the polluters, paying? And this is the important thing. People don't think they are polluters. So when I ask those questions in focus groups and surveys, they mean industry. People are absolutely convinced they are not polluters. But they do think that a system should be fair to help them adjust. And they do think that's them. So they do want incentives, and they do want support to help them in the transition. They want to believe and know that it works. If carbon pricing is designed in such a way that people are convinced it doesn't work, that emissions don't fall, that it's not fair, they're not going to support it. It needs to be fair and it needs to work. And they want it to be honest. There's a very serious problem with lack of trust in our institutions and our governments today, and people don't trust that governments can handle the money. So they don't want the money, the revenue raised from carbon pricing, going to government for running programs, for example. Although that's something that liberal-leaning people love, the idea of more incentives and programs, and they propose it all the time. The public don't believe that they'll be managed well. They prefer to see the money come to them, although we have inconsistent results. But generally speaking, they don't trust government to handle the money. So, back to my point, that if all of those conditions are not in play, or in place, we are vulnerable to this question of tax grab, unfair, raises cost of living, and doesn't even work. Now that you've heard that, pay attention to how people are talking about carbon pricing. Proponents are going to talk about it as polluter pay and fair and effective, and opponents are going to talk about it as a tax grab, unfair, raises cost of living, and doesn't even work. All right, just very quickly, this is my last couple of slides. I just want to share with you the outcome of 4 years of research on how to talk about carbon pricing. If you want to have conversations with friends and family about carbon pricing. You're here. The first thing is start with climate change. Start at a place where you're trying to find out from people what they care about, and then help them see how climate change might affect the things that they care about. So we're talking about climate change, it's human caused. It's happening now. It's affecting our health and safety because it makes floods, ice storms, and coastal erosion more extreme. These events force us out of our homes, threaten the places that we care about, and make us worry the next time the power will go out. We need to do something about it. Government must regulate polluters. Pricing the pollution that is unbalancing our climate makes sense. Carbon pricing is a part of a comprehensive climate plan that the vast majority of economists believe is a fair and effective way to make polluters accountable. You can acknowledge people have differing opinions about the best way to price pollution or what to do with the money collected, but doing nothing about climate change is not an option. I can tell you that when people are exposed to that narrative, the support for carbon pricing goes up significantly. We tell people it's normal. People don't want to think we're out there bleeding, what do they call that? The bleeding edge or whatever. So people need to know this is something normal. It's happening around the world. More than 70 jurisdictions are doing something on carbon pricing. And that is common sense. That there is an economist consensus. We have found that, in fact, telling people that there is a consensus among economists increases support for carbon pricing. All right, just quickly on what you can do. I know I went a bit longer, sorry. I should have timed it for you. I just want to say what you can do, partly because the point of carbon pricing is not to pay it, right? It's going to change your behavior, right? So you don't have to pay it. What are the big things you could do to actually save you from paying a carbon price? Clearly, citizenship would be great. It's not so much you're going to save on the financial side there, but it would be great if you supported carbon pricing as one part of a comprehensive plan. Taking to the streets, I want to point it out, we've got to make our voices heard, and there's a movement growing. People are starting to say this is it. And we need to tell our province to forget taking the federal government to court. New Brunswick has announced that it will join Saskatchewan and Ontario, challenging the federal government, their jurisdiction to apply a carbon price, and I think that's a waste of our taxpayers' dollars. And then just very quickly, the big things. We need to move away from the insignificant things. Flying. Number one thing that each of us is doing contributing to climate change. We need to deal with the meat that we eat, red meat in particular, especially if it's being bought through factory operations. We need to eat local, and we need to eat in season. These are the big things, believe it or not, that the IPCC talked about in its report. We need to switch up our vehicle where we don't have public transit, and obviously use public transit where we do, and where we can manage it to have a more efficient vehicle, and when the options are there, a non-emitting vehicle. These are the big areas where you can save money. Invest in your energy conserving options. Why would I have that down at the bottom? Partly because it's not as big as you think compared to these other things. Your car, your transportation, and your flying is more. And match your rebate. It's coming. Whether they go to court or not, January 1st, the federal system applies in New Brunswick. Take your rebate when you get it. Go see NB Power and double it up. And then invest in forest conservation. We need to expand that significantly in this province to help moderate our emissions. Okay, I'm sorry that took long. I'm done.